Hello everyone and welcome back to Automation Recipes. My name is Vinicius Maidana and this is the third part of the web automation series. If you remember, last part we stopped at this step right here during the building of our automation process. So far what we've done is we logged into this Orange HRM web page, which is a web application for human resources management. And now we were going to proceed with actually adding an employee to this system using this application and using IBM RPA to automate the process of adding a new employee using Orange HRM. So to proceed with this process, now what we're going to do is we're going to add an employee. And as I go along, I'm going to give you guys some more tips about using IBM RPA for web automation. Now, you may remember that if we want to insert an information into an input field, like the first name here, all we would need to do is right-click it, then click Inspect, and then use the information here. Specifically, we could use the ID, or maybe we could use, we could copy the selector, which is the element CSS, but basically we could use the backend code to have the bot identify this element and input some information there. And that's absolutely fine. We could do this with this element right here. Like I mentioned before in the previous part, this application is really clean. It's really easy to deal with. We could use the ID right here, which is just first name. But I want to do something different this time because I want to show you guys some more features of the IBM RPA web automation recorder. So you remember from our first part how to start the web automation recorder. We basically click on Start Recorder here on the studio. That's going to start our recorder. The drivers are loaded up. And now we need to activate the web recorder by pressing this button here. And then we need to activate the extension, the web automation recorder extension for IBM RPA here on Chrome. And now that the extension is activated and the web recorder is activated as well, everything I do on the browser is going to be translated into commands on IBM RPA Studio. So for instance, if I type my first name here, and I go back to the studio, you can see that I have some new commands here, which are basically one wait for element in a web page, a click on web page, another wait for element in a web page, and a set value to field. Now, this is basically me clicking on the field, on the input field for the first name, and then inputting a value there. And just like I mentioned before on our first session about web automation, every single action I perform on the browser while using the web recorder to implicitly translate my actions into commands in IBM RPA Studio, every single action is going to be preceded by a wait for element in the web page. And you may remember as well that this is not entirely necessary. We don't really need every single one of these commands to be, or every single one of these actions to be preceded by a wait for element in a web page. Remember, just to make it clear, the best practice, the good practice on using IBM RPA for web automation is to use the wait for element in a web page command before the first action on a new page. So we could basically just delete the second wait for element in the web page command and just leave the first one, which is this one. Now, one other thing that also we don't really need is actually the click on a web page command. Because remember, we don't really need to click on a field before setting value to it. The set value to field command already inputs information automatically onto the field without having to click on it, especially if we don't use the simulate human parameter. So, the click on web page command here also isn't really necessary. So we could also delete this one. Now, would leaving those commands that I deleted here, would leaving them here interfere with the automation? Would it make the automation break somehow? Probably not. As a matter of fact, most definitely not. There is absolutely no problem in having more than one wait for element in a web page command. There is absolutely no problem in clicking on an input field before using the set value to field command, there's absolutely no problem in that. The thing is, as you may know, and this is a best practice for development in general, your code needs to be as clean as possible. So having those commands that aren't really necessary there is truly a waste of code. You don't really need those commands there. If you leave them there, it's fine, but you don't need to. So you may as well just remove them and leave only the commands that you really need for your automation to work out fine, which is basically the wait for element in the web page command, to wait for that element to be fully loaded before trying to interact with it, and then using the set value to field command to set the value into the field per se. You may notice that both the wait for element in the web page command and the set value to field command are identifying the element, the input field, by using its ID. Like I mentioned, the ID is by default the one that you want to use. If the IDs on your web application are unique and easy to find, definitely prefer using those, because those tend to be the fastest way to identify elements. Of course, if you need to use the selector, which is a CSS, or if you need to use XPath, that's absolutely fine as well. There's no problem there. Just prefer using IDs if you can. Now, this is one way to use the web recorder, right? Performing actions on the browser, and the recorder automatically translates those actions into commands. But there's also another way to use the recorder, which is actually a very similar way to use the recorder for web automation as it is on the Windows automation. And you will remember this, especially if you watched our series on Windows automation on the Windows recorder, which is also a 3-part series that you should definitely watch if you haven't. But you can also use the Control key. You can also hold the Control key while having your mouse hovering over the element you want to map that element and then interact with it in a more explicit way. So for instance, I want to map the middle name field here. I'm going to just hover my mouse over it and then hold the Control key. And there you go. You can see that the element is highlighted in yellow, which means that the recorder has successfully mapped that element. And from here, it's exactly the same as using the Windows recorder, which is you basically come here and you choose one action to perform with that element. You can see the element is mapped, and you can see the element right here. All the characteristics of that element, its ID, its CSS, its name, the tag name, the XPath, everything is here. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to go into actions and then set value to field. And I'm going to put my name here, which is Maidana, which may come as a surprise to you, but it's actually my middle name. It's not my last name. And I'm going to save it. And the command is right here. It's already been inserted. Now, as you may have noticed, it also chose the ID as the selector, as the form of identifying the middle name field. And that is just one more evidence on how using IDs is the default way of trying to interact with elements on web automation. Now to proceed, another thing that I need to do now is input my name on the last name field. The only elements that here that are actually mandatory for registering a new employee is actually only the first name and the last name. But I want to cover all the fields here. So I'm going to perform the action here just like I did before. I'm going to map this element, and then I'm going to go into actions, set value to field, and then my last name, which is actually Alves. And the command is right here. So you may notice that this is exactly the same as using the Windows recorder. You may also notice that the color of the highlight is different. And this is something that I mentioned on our series about Windows automation, which is the color of the element indicates what kind of recorder you are using. For Windows applications, you're going to see a green highlight. For Java applications, you're going to see a red highlight. Here for web automation, you're going to see a yellow highlights, and it goes on. There are other kind of recorder drivers as well, but let's move on for now. Now, the employee ID is actually automatically generated. I'm not even going to mess around with this. The next thing I want to do is choose a file, a photograph file, to insert here. This is not mandatory, but I want to show you guys how to do this because this is an interesting tidbit. But first, before we do this, I'm going to close the recorder and I'm going to run the bot as it is. But of course, before I do that, you may notice that as I was performing some more actions on the browser, I clicked on the employee ID field. I have more commands here. I don't need this. And I also need to drag all of these commands from wait for element in the web page all the way to set value to the last set value to a field. And I need to drag all of them right before the close browser command. As you may remember, between the start browser and the close browser command, that is the web automation context. So everything you need to do in web automation needs to be between those two commands. There's also a navigate command here that was inserted automatically by the recorder. I don't need this, so I'm going to delete this. And I'm going to run this without debugging to see how it goes. So, like we did before, on the previous session, it's going to log in, it's going to navigate to the add employee page, and it inserted the information we wanted on the appropriate fields just fine. Now, the takeaway that I want to give you guys from this part is this: the web recorder has multiple ways. We have multiple ways of using it. We can just, perform actions on the browser, and those actions are going to be automatically translated into commands later. And you have the option of just leaving those commands exactly like they are without changing anything. But that's not the best practice. The best practice there is to actually parse through your code after using the web automation recorder in that implicit mode, so to speak. This is not an official term. I just made it up. And then parse through your code and see what exactly you need and you don't need, and delete everything you don't need, or comment it out, or reorganize the code as you see fit, as you see that is going to make the code cleaner and it's going to make it look better. That's basically how you use the web recorder when you're using it just to translate your actions into commands. It is very convenient to not have to insert commands into the script by using the web recorder, but you do need to keep in mind that you have to clean up your code later after you finish using the web recorder. That is the best practice. To clean up your code after using the web recorder. The second method of using the web recorder, like I showed you before, is to actually map the elements. Let me start the recorder here again, and I'm going to activate it here and here. So to actually, hover your mouse over the element holding the Ctrl key, and that's going to map the elements, going to highlight the element in yellow, and then you can proceed to interact with it just like you would with the Windows recorder. I kind of prefer it that way, because I feel like I'm more in control of how the automation is built. But you can use it however you see fit. Now, of course, the other option is to actually just do it all manually by inspecting elements and just, parsing through the back end and finding the necessary information you need to identify those elements by using the page's HTML code. How you develop your automation is entirely up to you. Whatever method you feel most comfortable with is absolutely fine. Now, like I mentioned before, next step before finishing the employee registration is to choose a photograph to upload here for the employee. Now, when you click on the Choose File command button here, this opens a file browser, and then you can navigate around your system to choose a photograph. I'm going to choose my own profile pic here that I use for pretty much everything. I love this picture. It's really beautiful. There's a beautiful waterfall in the background there. So I want to have the bot choose this file. So how can I do that? Okay. So basically what would you first do is you would I'm using the recorder here, so that's probably been translated into commands here. As you can see, all of the commands, all of the actions that I performed on the browser while talking to you guys with the recorder on have all been translated here into commands already. Now, for this kind of action specifically, where you click on a button on the browser and the system opens an open file dialog window, how you deal with that is a little bit more specific than how the recorder did for us here. So these last two commands here, we're not going to use that. And we're going to drag these two commands, which is the wait for element and the click on a web page, over here. Remember, this is not a new page, so we don't really need this wait for element in a web page here either. So we're going to delete that and just leave the click. And the click on a web page command here is trying to identify the element, the photo file element, by using its ID, which is, let's inspect the element here. It's right here. As you can see, the ID is right here. Right? Now, how you deal with open file dialogs in IBM RPA? There's actually a command specifically for that, which is called handle open file dialog. And I'm going to drag this command right after the click on a web page command, which is clicking on the photo file button right here. And basically, all I need to do here is just click on the file selection helper here. Navigate to the file that I want to be selected by the open dialog window, and just click on it, double click on it, and here you go, the path to the file that I want to be chosen by the bot when the system opens the open file dialog window is this one. And that's pretty much it. All I need to do is save, and that should be enough to choose that picture over there. Okay, so before we actually click on the last button, which is the save button here, to finally register this new employee, let's run this bot and see what happens. You may find this interesting. So let's just run it, and I will just let it run, and you're going to see what's going to happen. Now, you may notice that the bot has failed to click on the choose file, but the execution has finished. So, what is going on here? How about we try to inspect this element, inspect the choose file button, and we try to get a different kind of identifier. What about we try to copy the XPath and use that to identify the button? Is that going to help? Well, maybe. Let's find out. So, I'm going to just change here photo file from ID to XPath, and then paste the XPath right here, and then save it, and run the bot once more. Spoiler alert, it's not going to work again. So I'm just going to let it go to the end, and you're going to see that the bot's not going to be able to click on that button again. And then I'm going to explain to you why it's not going to work. Now, like I mentioned, not going to work. And if you go back to the studio, execution has already finished. So what is going on here? Okay. So basically, if we inspect this button, you may notice something very, very peculiar about it, which is, and this is very, very unique. It's like I always mention, it really depends on how the application was developed. So I'm going to inspect this element. And you're going to see that using the Chrome inspector, I have a few different results here. I have this element, which is the whole field here, and I have the button, which is right here. And you may notice that regardless of choosing the button or choosing this input field, which is not really a button, the result is the same. The photo file ID is the same for both elements. It's actually one single element, right? The button is inside this input field, right? And you can't really click on it because the button is this, but the element that I'm fetching using this backend is this whole thing. So the bot's trying to click on something that's not really a button, right? That's the thing. So how do I click on this button specifically? Well, this is where I'm going to show you that sometimes, even when you're using web automation, no matter what kind of selector, no matter what kind of identifier you use to try to identify a button or a field, sometimes nothing works. And again, like I always say, it really depends on how the application was developed. And in these cases, where using the back end of the page to identify an element doesn't work, you have to resort to screen scraping, which is basically image clicking. Now, you may remember from our Windows automation series, which is, I keep mentioning it, and this is another reason for me to just tell you, if you haven't seen it, you should really do. Because there's a lot of interesting information there. If we start the recorder here, one of the tools that we have here on the recorder bar up here is the snipping tool. And you may remember that we can use the snipping tool to map a specific part of the screen to perform some actions with that. So I'm going to map the choose file button here. I'm going to map it just so I can have just the button. I don't really need anything else. I just need the button itself. You can see that, let me close the Chrome Inspector. You can see that the choose file button is highlighted in green, which is what we expect. The recorder has mapped this specific element, this specific part of the screen. We scraped this part of the screen and we mapped this part of it. Now what we're going to do is we're going to right click inside the green area, click, and then at the image's center. And that's going to create an asset for us, which is the image of that button, which is right here. And this asset is going to be used by the bot, by IBM RPA, to identify what part of the screen it needs to click at. And this is important, okay? Since this is not Windows automation, we're not really automating a Windows application, we're automating a web application, we need to activate the in relation to the screen parameter. Because then, in this case, it's going to try to click on this specific image in relation to the entire screen. It's not going to look on one specific window, one specific application window that is attached in the execution context. No. It's going to look on the entire screen. It's going to scrape the entire screen. And when it finds the image that matches this asset that we created using the snipping tool, then it's going to click right at the center of that image. Right? I'm going to lower the similarity degree to 90% because it's actually a pretty unique button in the screen, and it's going to make our automation a little bit faster. I'm going to save this, and then when we go back to the studio, we can see right here that the click command has been created. I just need to drag the click command over here right before the handle open file dialog command, and I'm going to just delete the click command that we did before by using the XPath, because that's just not going to work. And before we run the bot, we need to come here to the handle open file dialog and tell it what's the title of the file of the open file dialog window that opens up. If we notice, when we click on the choose file, the open file dialog window shows up and the title is just open. So we can just type that over at the handle open file log command here on the title parameter, just open and then save. And then I'm going to start without debugging again, and this time it's going to work. It's going to log into the Orange HRM system. It's going to navigate there first, log into the HRM system, then navigate to the Add Employee page, insert all the information, click on Choose File, and it shows my profile picture, the one that I chose to use as the profile picture here. So everything's fine. The process is pretty much done. All we need to do now is click on the Save button, and the employee is going to be registered. But there is one more tip that I want to give you guys that you may encounter while automating web applications. And that is basically, I'm going to expect the Save button. And that is basically when you encounter dynamic IDs. Now, dynamic IDs are actually very common in many web applications nowadays. And they are pretty much exactly what you think they are. They're IDs to elements that are dynamically generated as the page is generated, is loaded, right? So how do you deal with dynamic IDs? Because the problem with dynamic IDs is that not only IDs are dynamic normally, when dynamic IDs are there, everything else is also dynamic. The XPath is also dynamic. Everything is dynamic. So how do you deal with that? When you encounter dynamic IDs, how do you deal with that? There is a very simple solution to that. And you may be surprised at how simple it is to actually solve that issue, which is basically what we're going to do is this save button does not have a dynamic ID. I could just use the btn save ID right here and it would work just fine. But let's pretend that this is a dynamic ID, right? How do I deal with this? Well, I inspected the element that I want to interact with, and it has a dynamic ID. Basically, all I have to do is, on the inspector here on the back end that I have here, I'm going to just delete the ID. And by delete, I mean everything, even the ID tag, everything. Just delete everything. And then hit enter. From here, I'm going to right click after deleting the ID. I'm going to right click on the element, copy, and then copy selector. And whatever is on my clipboard now is the thing that I'm going to use to identify this element. And I'm going to show you the difference right now. So let's find the web click command and insert it here on our bot, right after the handle open file dialog command. Search for CSS and paste whatever the inspector gave us, whatever the inspector inserted into our clipboard, which is this thing right here. Now, I want you to pay attention, okay? I'm going to start a notepad here. And I'm going to paste this CSS that we copied after deleting the ID, okay? Pay attention to this. Now, I'm going to go back to the page. And on this other browser that I have opened on the page here, if I inspect the save element again, you can see that the ID is still here, btn save, right? So I'm going to do the same without deleting the ID. I'm going to right click, copy, copy selector. And now I'm going to paste it here on our notepad. See the difference? See that when there is an ID there, the inspector gives me the hashtag, the CSS for the ID. When I delete the ID, and then I ask the inspector to copy the selector for that element after deleting the ID, basically what's going to happen is the browser inspector is going to rummage around the page's backend and find whatever it can find to identify that specific element. So whatever selector it can find, it's going to get that for you, and that's what you're going to use to interact with the element. I know it sounds crazy simple, and that's because it is. Basically, all I have to do is delete the ID, and then copy the selector after deleting the ID in the browser inspector, and it doesn't matter what browser you're using. It could be Firefox as well, for instance. It's going to find the CSS selector for that element. Now that it doesn't have the ID anymore, it's just going to have to work itself out to find the selector, the CSS selector for that element, right? So we already saved this click on web page command here with the selector that we got after deleting the ID, right? So I'm just going to now run the bot without debugging. I'm going to close everything else. Let me close this notepad as well. And now I'm going to run the bot. And this time, it should do everything and finally register this new employee. It's going to choose my profile picture and click on the save button. And there you go. As you can see, everything worked out just fine. all the name input fields were filled out correctly. The profile picture was selected by the bot and uploaded to the web page, to the web application, just fine. And it also clicked on the save button by using the CSS selector that we got after deleting the element's ID. And that's the end of our web automation series. I hope you learned something with all of these tips that I gave you. There's still a lot more to say, of course. Web automation and, well, automation in general is a very vast subject. But the tips that I gave you on the series should set you up on the correct path to successfully developing web automation. Remember that the tips that I gave you here on how to identify elements can be used for any occasion, not just inputting information. So for instance, if I wanted to capture this employee ID here, I could just inspect the element. I could use its ID or CSS selector or whatever I wanted, like this ID here that we have here for this element. I could use this with the web get command, which is the get element value. And I could use that ID right here to capture the element's value. As a matter of fact, let's try doing that before we wrap up. One last thing. So I'm going to cancel this. I'm also going to delete this employee. I'm going to go back to the employee list. You can see the employee here, 0029. I'm going to delete that. And I'm going to run the bot again. But first, let me just navigate to an employee page here. I have my own other registration. And I'm going to inspect this element, get this ID, copy that. Then I'm going to get element value. Put it here, paste that ID right here. Also want to use the web wait command to wait for that element, because the web application automatically navigates to that page after registering the employee, right? So I'm going to just wait for the element to pop up. I'm going to wait for it for 10 seconds. I also need an output value for that variable, of course. So I'm going to store the value here, and then use the log message command, and then use that value here. So let's see here. Let me just close everything and run the bot again. It's going to do the whole thing again. It's going to register me again. This is going to be the third time I'm being registered in this system. So it's going to log into the page. Employee list, choose file. Remember, this time my ID is no longer 0029, 0030, even though I deleted my previous registration. As you can see there, my employee ID this time is different. So if I go back to the studio now, you can see the ID right here, 0030, just like here. So, you can capture values from web application elements just as easy as you can input values into those elements. So again, hope you enjoyed this series. Hope all of these tips help you out in the future. There's still a lot to learn, but just like everything else in life, it's a matter of practice, right? So go out there and play around with web automation. I'm sure you'll have a lot of fun. So thank you for your attention on this series. Hope you learned something. Hope you enjoyed it. And I'll see you next time.